Hello and welcome to this episode of the Insurrection Interviews podcast and to Magic and Ecology, the series of online and in-person events where we aim to think the uncertainty of this planet's future through the possibilities thrown up by the concept of magic or possibility itself. I am Simone Kotva and this is my co-host Alice Tarbach.
Hello.
And today we're talking the ecology of magic, animal becoming, and so much more with Dr. David Abram. David is a cultural ecologist, philosopher, and sleight-of-hand magician whose groundbreaking work has been critical in demonstrating the parallels between environmental thinking and animism, bringing indigenous epistemologies into dialogue with Western philosophy. In the 1990s, David coined the term more than human, a concept which draws out the overlap that exists in many traditional societies, as well as in pre-modern philosophy, between spiritual beings and non-human creatures. An overlap that, he argues, can help us to unlearn the modern dualisms of mind over matter that have proven so unhelpful to environmental thinking. In his recent work, Becoming Animal, an Earthly Cosmology, David continues to explore what it is like to be human in a more than human world. Here he reflects at length on language and speech, and on the relationship so often overlooked between the way in which we name things in our environment and our ability to perceive and to participate in that environment with care, but also with pleasure and joy. One of the striking features of David's work is the pleasure taken in the act of speaking and writing itself, making storytelling about the more than human, a means of thinking with the varied forms of earth living. His writing becomes itself a means of transforming our perception of what is described, told, and named. David's work on ecology and magic has been instrumental in catalyzing several new disciplines, and he's been the recipient of various awards and fellowships, including Rockefeller and Watson Fellowships and the Lannan Literary Award for Nonfiction. As one of the very first writers to talk about the relationship between ecology and magic, David's work has been an inspiration for both of us, and not least for this project. So it is a special delight and honor to have him here with us today. And now, without further ado, please welcome Dr. David Abram.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's good. So I'm David, and I'm a cultural ecologist and a philosopher who some call a geophilosopher. That is somebody who is working out the ways of thinking, ways of speaking under the influence of a more than human earth. My particular fascinations as an ecologist are first and foremost the ecology of perception, or what we could call the ecology of sensory experience, the way the activity of our ears and our eyes and our skin functions to bind our separate nervous systems into the encompassing ecosystem. Yeah, as though sensory perception was like a kind of glue, binding or connecting up, entangling and attuning our individual nervous systems into the wider encompassing ecosystem. But I'm also deeply fascinated with what we could call the ecology of language. How what we say so profoundly influences what we see, what we hear, what we taste of the earth around us. I'm convinced that there are ways of speaking that can enhance and encourage that instinctive rapport between our animal senses and the animate earth. But I'm also quite convinced that there are other ways of speaking, many of which we've inherited from this goofy civilization into which most of us have been born, ways of speaking that work to frustrate, to inhibit that spontaneous kinship or reciprocity between our body and the breathing earth around us. And so I'm always exploring ways of speaking otherwise, ways of thinking in fresh and strange new ways that are sometimes also very old ways.
Thank you so much, David. And that's a lovely encapsulation of some of the paths that we are hoping to walk down, the three of us, this evening in our interview. And I wonder if we could come first, if you like, on our journey following that lovely summation by discussing, if you wouldn't mind, some of the influences which drew you toward and informed your linking ecology with the concept of magic. For those listening along, what might magic feel like to you in relation to the more than human world? Where might it be located? I'm very interested in that linking.
Well, magic is, it's a wild and unruly word, and one would be very foolish if one tried to define something as outrageous and uncanny as magic. For me, magic is first and foremost an experience of shuddering wonder at the strangeness of the real in its inexhaustible weirdness. The sense of being alive inside a world that is itself alive through and through, wherein each thing, each stone, each branch, each mountain and river and storm cloud and house and broken down automobile has its own agency, its own life, its own vitality, its own ability to affect the space around it and the things around it, to affect us as well, and sometimes, often, to respond to us. So magic for me is, in this sense, it speaks of a kind of a relation to the mysterious, what some might speak of as the holy or the sacred, but a relation to the sacred that is fully immanent, that is not at all a relation to a transcendent realm radically outside the world to which our bodies and our bodily senses give us access, but rather a sense of the sacred or the holy or the mysterious as permeating and pulsing within everything we encounter with our animal senses. So a fully immanent sense of the sacred, which I think is beckoning to all of us today. In a sense, I suppose I carry an intuition that when we're speaking of course, the sacred, we're speaking of something that overlaps with and engages with what many folks call religion. But for me, magic is not at all linked to religion. Well, it's as if all of the formal or world religions have at their heart, at the heart of Christianity, at the heart of Judaism, of the Muslim faith, of Buddhism, one finds the mystical tradition of that religious form. But at the core of the mystical tradition, one finds the magical tradition, which is, one could say, the mysticism of this world, of the body's world, of the earthly world, the mystery of the material world itself, as something inexhaustibly strange and mysterious. And in that sense, one might suspect that the magical practices, or the magical tradition that I'm suggesting is at the core of each of the mystical traditions, that the magical tradition is in many ways a body of practices and experiences that are a holdover, direct holdover from the older indigenous, pre-religious, animistic bodies of insight and knowledge that were our human birthright for 98, 99% of our human tenure here within the biosphere. So I see magic as very much connected up with and part and parcel of the indigenous ways, as multiple as those ways are, each place, each bioregion, and each ecosystem of the earth yielding a different modality of practice that held the human communities there in intimate relation and reciprocal relation with the surrounding terrain. Ways of ensuring that the human community never took more from the land than it was returning to the land, with praises, with prayers, with propitiations and offerings, but ways of participating intimately in the experience of other species and of the weather, the elemental earth, the mountains and the rivers. So that's a few of the ways in which I might articulate the meanings of magic for me.
Something that came up there that I'm really interested in is the notion of sudden recognition, partial recognition, glimmering in and out, if you like, between the complex selfhoods of and selves and lives of all things around us, and a sense of being in our own bodies. And the way you speak there about magic, it is almost as if there is a sort of passing space between us and our full apprehension of the world as complicated as we have been taught to think that we are. And I was wondering if you could talk a little about the mechanisms for moving through that interstitial space, the courting of apprehension or the practice of apprehension, because I think perhaps that touches on some of the ways you were discussing diverse magical practice and linking that back to ecologies of perception.
Interesting. Well, I suppose for me that I think of the body, the human body, this two-handed, two-armed, two-legged form as our very capacity for metamorphosis. That the body is an inherently shape-shifting creature. It has something in it of anything that we encounter. We've got our stony bones and skeleton, our leaf-like skin. We've got rivers and brooks and streams coursing through our bloodstream. That is, we are composed of the same stuff as the rest of this earthly world. And so my body, by its very nature, has a capacity to feel into, to resonate with, to be infected by, and sometimes become possessed by any other body that I encounter, whether it be the body of an oak tree or of a spider spinning its web, or the body of a boulder covered with crinkly black and red lichens, I can yield or open up my sense of my own self-enclosed interiority. Since I have a sense that there are things moving inside my organism, and the flux and pulse of my own subjectivity seems to go deeply with being this body that I am, I might suspect that every other body has its own flux of subjectivity or sentience or some vague form of experience, vaguely related, even if it's very distantly related to my own. And so I can lean into that, or even quite literally lean against that boulder and rest my head upon it when I need to take a nap. But what dreams enter into me, infect me, informed by that lichen encrusted flesh of granite? And how are those dreams different from those that come into me when I'm sleeping below a sandstone cliff? Things inform and entangle my own physicality in ever so many ways. The body is not a closed capsule. It's this outrageously open-ended, many-sensed creature that is drawing all the space around me into myself with every in-breath. And with every out-breath, I am riding out into the wider body of the land. But these trees, those clouds overhead, the broken down artifacts at the nearby town dump, all also are spreading or flooding into me with every in-breath. So I am participant just by virtue of being a living body in so many other bodies. And in that way, now I can't always, you spoke of this glimmering sense, I can't always, or it would be kind of silly and in fact quite difficult and dangerous to try to be attuning to and open to every other sensitive and sensate form in the terrain at every moment, because I wouldn't be able to function very well in terms of getting food for my family, cooking, keeping my home, functioning at a basically operative level for my kids. That is, there are so many ways, particularly in this very strange civilization, that we need to get on with our lives that are frustrated by these ways, are frustrated or confounded if we're engaged all the time with these other shapes of sensitivity and sentience that surround us in the land. And so, much like breathing, there's sometimes I need to be resting within myself. Sometimes I need to be spreading out into the wider world. I'm not suggesting that we have to all the time be attentively tuned to what's going on with the other shapes or the other beings. And yet, I do think it's possible to hold open one's awareness, to keep one's skin to keep the pores always pricked open, and aware, that is to have a sense on the periphery all the time that one is entangled and meshed with many other shapes of intelligence besides one's own, other humans as well, but not just humans, so many other forms of sensitivity and sensibility. Does that touch on that rich question you asked?
Absolutely. I think for me, it was precisely that, this idea that some of where I, for example, might locate magic is in the act of attunement and in the shifting between the
Yes.
borders of the self and the maintenance of a functional self, as you say, in this strange society. Simone, I'm sure that you have questions you would wish to come in with.
Thank you. And thank you, David, so much. I
Sure.
especially loved what you said about attentiveness and attention. I'm reminded of how in Christian mysticism, for instance, but it's true of, as you said, any mystical tradition where you find the magic, there is this distinction between paying attention and being attentive. And paying attention is something that you can only really do in sort of bursts of concentration and bursts of effort. And we think about the special circumstances that allowed monks and nuns to have these ecstasies. But then there was another kind of attention that they recognized could be cultivated and practiced all the time. And that was this being attentive. And it's often compared to the way a plant was able to open itself and be attentive to the sun of justice. And those sorts of ideas I found to be so generative because they break out of this idea that we have that what you describe here as animism isn't a kind of special worldview that you can only access if you're a spirit doctor in a tribe far flung somewhere. But this is actually a way of life that we can practice, not by appropriating somebody else's culture, but by discovering those aspects of our own way of being human. I'd love to hear more about, this will come back, I think, later as well, but attention and also what you mean by animism.
Well, I think, yes, animism is so often thought of as the projection of human subjectivity or human consciousness into non-human things, including, yes, stones, mountains, but also sculpted forms, other animals, to be sure, plants, but also the walls of a building. But I don't think that this is, I think that's a very unfortunate way of framing what I would suggest is our most basic, most normal way of perceiving the world, that sensory experience, sensory perception in its most baseline form, that the senses, our animal senses, spontaneously experience the things around us as animate, as pulsing with life or with agency, that nothing is experienced by our unaided bodily senses as utterly inert and inanimate. We speak in English often of how things catch our attention or call our gaze or draw our focus. All of these ways of speaking are very precise, actually, because our body feels itself snagged, actively snagged by other presences. Now in the autumn, I was cycling yesterday and riding along the road, rolling along. There was one very bright colored leaf on the ground, stuck to the ground with moisture, but that just, snagged my focus and drew me to turn the bike around, to wheel around and pedal back to that leaf and gaze it. And in fact, invited me to pick it up and stash it in my helmet. We're always, our sensory experience is being solicited actively by the things around us. We never experience anything as definitively inanimate or inert. That's a very recent assumption. So for me, animism is just it's sort of ground zero for the human creature. It's our most ordinary, normal way of encountering the world, is to feel that anything I can see or hear or encounter with my senses, the intuition, the hunch, no, even the felt experience that it itself is a sensate, sensitive, even sentient form. And like I say, I think this is just normal. I think this is the way perception itself operates. Any presence, one of the ponderosa trees around this house here, as I'm strolling through the woods, may call my attention. And so I turn to face that ponderosa. That is, it calls to me, I respond to it by turning toward it, and then it responds to my focus or my turning toward it by revealing something afresh, which leads me to step still closer, to perhaps bring my nose into the furrows of its bark, which then allows the tree to spread some of this rich vanilla-like or butterscotch smell up into my nose, and it floods my neurons. That is, I'm caught in a kind of nonverbal dialogue with this other presence, and each response I make opens another response by the other. And we're always drawn into dialogue with the things around us, in which a dialogue, I'm calling it because I am not the only active player here. The things themselves are always agential, are always engaging us, even such a ostensibly inanimate thing as a stone. So that's my sense, that animism is just utterly normal, plain. The way our senses experience the world in the absence of intervening technologies. Now, for most of us today, there are so many technologies that intervene between our senses and the earthly sensuous. And I think this has something to do with how distant this mode of experience can feel to many of us.
I wanted to follow that. I think it's such a foundational idea, thank you, this idea that it is our natural way of experiencing the world when that experience is not occluded. I wanted to talk about how we deal with the necessary occlusions that come with communicating those experiences outside of our bodies and toward an audience, specifically and particularly the idea of experiencing and then putting into writing what one has experienced, to be read in a book held in the hand in a library or on an ebook on a screen. And I think there are two questions there. One about material technologies of reading and communication, but also about how possible it might be to formalize through accepted language and alphabet the experience of being in the world.
You mentioned that I had coined this phrase, the more than human world, in my first book, The Spell of the Sensuous. Yeah, the subtitle was Perception and Language in a More Than Human World. And you gave such an interesting gloss on that phrase, relating it to a sense of dimensions beyond the material world, or so it sounded to me. And I wanted to say that for me, what I meant by the more than human world, first and foremost, and especially, was just that I was just very frustrated by the way our language distinguishes the human world of awareness, consciousness, and culture from the rest of nature, which was spoken of as nature, as if there's nature out there and there's the human world in here. So then I tried writing of human nature and non-human nature, but I still found that divide, that there's this fence, human nature on one side, non-human nature on the other side. And I realized what I was trying to say, to find some way of articulating, is that there's a human world that is nested within and permeated by the wider, more than human world of nature, but that we were entirely of nature. Yes, permeated by it, infiltrated, completely part and parcel of this natural world. And yet there was something about nature that necessarily exceeds the human. It's always more than human. It's not just us. There are also so many other creatures, whales and elephants and spiders and toads and ponderosa pine trees and aspen groves and cloud shapes and slithering snakes gliding off through the grass. So it was really, first and foremost for me, a way of just saying that the human is a subset within a larger set. There's the human world, there's the more than human world that includes the human, but is more than us. It exceeds us. And so I just wanted to clarify that, because I did very much enjoy then using this phrase that seemed to also suggest a kind of qualitative excess, that the more than human was not just wider than us, but had something qualitatively more, that there was more, perhaps more value in the world if we recognize that we're part of something that exceeds us. And for me, that's really important. Like today, circulating throughout the discourse, both within and outside of the academic world, is this fairly newer phrase, the Anthropocene, and that we are living into the Anthropocene epoch, this new geological epoch, which I don't have any disagreement with what this name purports to name, that we humans, that the human species has now become a geological force of tremendous oomph and strength. But because since I've been a small child, it's been obvious that our species is a powerful geological force. But there are others, hurricanes and earthquakes and rampaging epidemics, and that are not themselves particularly human. But by giving it this name, the Anthropocene, we imply that the human, that our species, anthropos, is now coextensive with the whole of the biosphere. That is, the Anthropocene implies that there is no more than human world. It is now a human world. And I think that is a great mistake and an inane form of hubris, a kind of crazy arrogance that leads many good-hearted folks to think that, well, if we're now living in the Anthropocene, it's on us, two-leggeds, to grab the reins of this biosphere and begin to manage it as best we can, of course, for our own purposes. And that's what we've been trying to do these last many centuries. I think Anthropocene is a pretty good name for the regime we've been living through these last 500, perhaps 1,000, perhaps a couple thousand years, thinking that humans were at the center and the heart of the world, and everything else was placed here or created for us to use. But this outrageous moment we're now living in is precisely the moment, I think, to awaken and step back from that hubris, to drink a tall glass of humility and realize that, yes, a certain humbleness is really hugely called for now. How do we come to feel and recognize ourselves as a plain member of the biotic community, as Aldo Leopold called it, a plain citizen? So I just wanted to clarify that. I think if there was a name I might suggest for this epoch or era, of course, many people have proposed all sorts of interesting names, like the Capitalocene or the Cthulhucene. But my scientific colleagues say, no, what's important is that we underscore that humans have been the cause of so much of this disruption within the biosphere. We need to name our own species as part and parcel at the center of this onrushing epoch. Well, then I think we shouldn't use the term anthropos. We should use the term human and recognize that it is cognate with the word humble and the word humility, both derived from the humus, from the soil. And so perhaps we could think of this era as the Humilocene, the era of humility, which sounds kind of weird to our ears at first, because it has echoes of humiliation, perhaps. But I think that's good, because we ought to be humiliated by what we have wrought, by the tremendous number of species shoved over the brink of extinction as a result of our obliviousness. So the Humilocene, or the humbling, my friend Dugald Hine calls it, the humbling, that's the name, I would say, of this era. So yeah, I just needed to say a bit about the more than human world as a phrase for me, and what it speaks to.
When I first saw this phrase, more than human, as a theologian, it inverted this classical hierarchy of the human in the middle and the more than human above, angels and gods and spirits. And Maybe we'll come back to talk about spirits later. And then the non-human is sort of below it. And simply by naming the non-human the more than human, it wasn't so much an inversion as a kind of coming full circle, which is also how you describe it, because suddenly to me, it made sense of a lot of the mystical texts where this coming full circle has already happened. I mentioned the plants being compared to a mystic praying to God. You know, it's already there in all these texts, and opened my eyes to what's there in the tradition.
I'm delighted by that resonance. And yeah, maybe it's useful to speak here of just our sense of the spiritual, or our sense of the spirits. Since for me, I find I have a strangely warped sense of the meaning when folks speak of the spiritual, warped relative to the conventional take on our word spirit as being something utterly immaterial. I've been hugely affected by the fact that the word spirit derives from the Latin spiritus, which originally denoted a breath or a gust of wind. And just as our word psyche, for which we speak of, with which we speak of the human consciousness or mind, derives from this older Greek term, psyche, that the verb psychein meant to breathe or to blow like the wind. And a psyche or a psyche in ancient Greece was a breath or a gust of wind. And I find that the assumption that the spiritual world is elsewhere, is outside of the sensuous or outside of the material, earthly world, very strange and quite goofy. This sense that the spirits are supernatural robs nature or the earthly world of its outrageous and inexhaustible weirdness. How much of this palpable, sensuous reality we are embedded within is filled with enigma, mystery, invisibility. When we speak of the wind or the breath, we're speaking of an invisible dimension of our bodily experience, of the sensuous, of the earthly world itself. We live and walk within a world that is not just visible. People speak of the visible world, and then there's the invisible world, which is construed as being somewhere else, behind, above, beyond. But the visible world itself is permeated with invisibility. In fact, if the air that enfolds me were not invisible, I wouldn't be able to see anything else. The air is that through which I see all things. So it seems to me, first and foremost, that the invisible is just, as the word says, in the visible. It's right here, between me and you and the screen of this computer and the trees sprouting up around this building. So the spirits, when my native friends, my Pueblo friends here where I live in northern New Mexico, it's the northern Rio Grande Valley, many Pueblo villages dot the valley around here, speaking the Tewa language, the Tiwa language, others the Toa, And these languages are actually quite divergent and different from one another. But among the native Pueblos, whenever one of my sisters or brothers there speaks of the spirits, we really misinterpret that if we think that they're speaking of something outside of the earthly or the sensuous. When native folks on this continent are alluding to the spirits, they're often speaking of little gusts, whirlwinds, breezes, a certain breeze that comes up just at dawn and pours through a particular pass in the mountains, winds and powerful wind patterns. So for me, first and foremost, the word spirit, I suppose it's already plural, it's the spirits, and the spirits are very much of this world. They're very much of the sensuous. Yes, often invisible, but sometimes they make themselves strangely visible when snow is falling, for instance, and cascading around you. And suddenly the currents in the air and the wind are made visible by those slowly falling, cascading flakes of white.
There is a Scottish Gaelic term, the wind that shakes the long grasses, which is the best translation, which they say is when the Aoshi, or the spirits, are moving through because they're not very tall. Their wind only shakes the grass, which I think is lovely.
Just so. By which, of course, I don't mean, and I don't think you mean to, in any way, to reduce our sense of the spirit and spirituality, but rather to expand and open up our sense of materiality, to open up our sense of the richness and strangeness, the uncanniness of the physical world itself, of matter and materiality itself. Yeah.
Absolutely, and the idea that these phrases exist to capture aspects of materiality which are strange to us, not to imply that there is something strange that causes from something beyond the material that causes them necessarily. Yeah. There is magic enough in them themselves, I think.
Let's read the question from Siddharth Sunday. Since your work deals so much with attention and attentiveness to landscape and the natural world, how do you understand the role played by the digital world in reshaping this notion of attention? Do you think there is a danger of losing out on the sustenance of embodied attention in work and practice because of the hyper-digital environment we find ourselves in for work and leisure, particularly in the ongoing pandemic period?
Wow, that's a huge question and awfully important. In some ways, to approach it when, something in me would normally want to speak first of language, and because the digital world is so much a communication technology, it's a morphing within our ways of communicating, first and foremost linguistically, but I can certainly at this juncture just say that it has a strangely disembodying power. It itself is a kind of magic, a very rich and complex, everything we term technology, any particular technology, can, I think, usefully be recognized as a form of magic, one that engages our bodily senses in ways that affect us in more than purely rational ways. The digital revolution seems to have this remarkably disembodying power that it brackets out all of, or so many of the ways of speaking, of communicating without words that happen when we're sharing the same breath, the same ruach in Hebrew, the same spirit, because our bodies are emplaced in the same space, the same room, trading breath in and out with one another and with all the plants who are breathing around us, offering up the oxygen that we animals need for our metabolism. When we're separated from one another by huge distances and then log on through a screen and encounter one another through the screen, I don't see most of your organism. I don't see your legs, most of your torso, even your arms are sort of out of play, as are mine, through the screen. So we're just sort of heads speaking back and forth. It puts so much more emphasis just on the linguistic and verbal aspect of our communication, and leaves hence most of our bodily senses out of play. So we're brought into a very cognitive, very abstract form of interaction. The trouble is that when so much of the body is left out of play or immobilized in front of the screen, this animal body is my access to the animate landscape around me, to the bodies of other creatures, as we've been saying, the bodies of plants, trees, even whole forests around me here where I'm speaking to you, the mountains, the rivers, the clouds, the storms, the gusts of wind, all have much less access to our speaking, much less of a way in to inform and influence our conversation when we're engaged with one another through the digital ether. And so it seems to me this is kind of risky, or more than risky. It's quite dangerous and unfortunate at a time when so much of the breathing earth is under assault by our species, not through any meanness or coldness of heart, but because we just don't really notice that the rest of the breathing earth is breathing. We don't really feel our entanglement with other creatures, with the forests or with the storm clouds, because we're so disembodied already. We're so cut off from our senses. We don't trust our sensory experience. I was taught when I was in high school and then in my college science classes, don't trust your senses. The senses are deceptive. The truth is what's always hidden behind the scenes, behind the sensuous. And so I think a great deal of the ecological mess, the horror of this moment with so many other shapes of sensitivity and sentience being pushed to the brink of the abyss and then kicked over that brink into oblivion, is happening not because we are an ugly creature ourselves, but because we've become so disembodied, so oblivious. because we already put so much attention just in the cognitive aspect of our lives. We think that what we are minds that just got stuck in these bodies or imprisoned in these bodies. Or if we are of a more theological bent, we speak of the body as the temple of our spirit or of our soul or mind. But that's very, very different from really identifying with your animal flesh, feeling that your whole two-legged, two-armed form is the very body of your soul, the flesh of your sentient presence. Then we're in much more attunement and rapport with what's going on in the place, in the land around us. But when we're so disidentified with our bodies, so split and cut off from them, we easily bring about the wreckage and fragmentation of so many ecosystems and so much habitat of other creatures. And it seems to me that the computer and the digital world extends our abstraction and distraction.
Thank you so much. That was an answer that I think opens a lot of avenues further. And I wonder if there is a question in there about the relationship between attunement, awareness of self and environment, reciprocity, sacrifice, and duty. How do we figure out how to be stewards in the world, attuned to stewardship through, is that the right way? Through intelligence of the body and the self. I'm interested, mosquito-like, in the relationship between reciprocity and discomfort, because I think we have complicated bodily experiences with the world, and we've talked about some wonderful ones, trees and forests and storms, but I wonder also about the things that appeal rather less to us, insects and illnesses and dry rot that creeps through wood and all such things.
I mean, those things are utterly of the essence of the material and bodily field. The carnal world is a world of muck and difficulty and ache and susceptibility and massive vulnerability to a world of things and beings that many of which are bigger than us and can eat us, and many of which are smaller than us and eat away at us and bring us down like strange spirochetal bacteria, COVID-19. To give ourselves to the body and the body's world is to open ourselves to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. I mean, there's reason that we in the West, and especially in the Christianized West, in the alphabetized world of Western civilization, have been in steady flight from the body and embodiment, because it's not a nice world. It's an outrageously beautiful world, but it ain't pretty. It's laced with shadow and predation and aching loss and grief and difficulty. But I don't know, without all that muck and shadow, the world might yield a bit of happiness, but never joy. The just sound in joy, the J, bespeaks the friction, the difficulty that is utterly integral to being alive, and the spice and seasoning that yields a sense of deep wonder and astonishment. So it seems to me that that opening oneself to the material and to one's bodily presence as one's emplacement within this field, this blooming, buzzing proliferation of shape and color and form, is, at first, it can feel to folks like, whew, there's so much pain here. There are so many losses. There are so many wounds in the landscape around me here. Why would I want to really be tasting the world with my animal senses all open and awake? And so many people will, right from the first, flinch and step back into that more abstract, cognitive, disembodied mode of thinking and looking at the world as if from outside. But if one sticks with it, if one has and musters a bit of the courage needed to meet the monstrosity of the real in its wildness, then you find that that edge of terror is just a kind of threshold. It's a gate through which you step into a world of wonders, of worlds within worlds within worlds. Yes, where there's difficulty, loss, illness, gashing, wounds, but also exquisite, mind-shattering ecstasy, joys of so many styles and rhythms. And so one comes into a world of wonders that I do think is our birthright. It's a magical world wherein human intelligence is just such a small part of the world's intelligence, the many-shaped, many-voiced intelligence of the forests and of the desert. So I think there was another piece to your question, but
I think the second part of that question, which I think you've touched on in enormous detail actually here, is about how we might, through this awareness, move toward a more integrated view that would facilitate a degree of stewardship. Because Simone and I work a lot together on this idea of different occult, magical, spiritual, practical meshings of ecologies of self and ecologies of the world, and how they might support one another toward moving back from the abyss a little.
Well, I have to admit that the word stewardship is not a word that's close to me, because it has, at least on this continent, I'm across the ocean from the two of you, but at least on this continent, stewardship has many sort of hierarchical resonances, that the human is the steward of the land, is still a somewhat Christian sense of our status relative to all the other creatures and to the plants. I'm much more interested in our participation in the land, in being vividly engaged in this dance wherein so many other bodies are engaged. Can we find a good dance in relation to the real, in its wonder and wildness? Can we as humans live in such a way that honors, that blesses the life around us and brings some fresh beauty to the world? But I don't think of it in terms of stewardship. I don't know that I'm particularly well placed to answer the question when it's framed in that manner. I do think as humans we have a huge responsibility to the living land, the many-voiced wildness of our world, as celebrants of that world, as humble participants in that world, as creatures who bless the world with our attention, who drink in through our eyes and our ears and our skin the shattering power of certain presences. A crow or raven, swooping by overhead, squawking down at us. Or that spider in the corner of your room up on the 18th floor of some skyscraper, the spider spinning her web, setting each knot and then spiraling around as this web comes into being, almost like watching the cosmos being born out of nothing. We humans seem to have a way of drinking in these weirdnesses, these wonders, and transmuting it, alchemizing it into expression, into creative expression, into song, scrumptious craft and art and architecture, always informed by the ways of other beings. So that's, I suppose, more how I think of this, how our human way of attending to and letting ourselves get fascinated by pretty much any facet of the more than human field can then be transmuted and transformed into an expression that feeds back into the breathing landscape around and offers it a new layer of blessing, a new layer of exuberance. So
I was wondering if you could talk more about modes of participation, almost in a kind of technical way. What are some of the ways in which we can participate? And writing came up in our introduction, and we touched on it again as a way of expressing this participation. It can take us deeper into modes of being more than human, but it can also draw us away from it when it's mediated in such a way, right, that it distracts us and makes us inattentive.
Well, I think it's maybe important to put something else on the table here in our discussion, which is I left something sort of incomplete by speaking of animism as this felt sense or experience of of the sensuous world as alive and agential, of things as having their own vitality and ability to affect the things around them, the space around them, that I was speaking of this sensory aspect of animism as the experience of a world that is alive, awake, aware through and through. But I didn't or forgot to affirm what I think is utterly key to this most basic, ordinary human modality of experience, which is a sense not just that everything is alive, but that everything speaks. That everything speaks. It's just most things don't speak in words. But all things have the power of meaningful speech, of utterance, cricket rhythms as a kind of speech or expression that carries meaning. The gurgling of frogs, of course, the speech and songs of birds or of humpback whales, but also just the chattering of leaves as the wind gusts through the branches, the wind in the willows, if you will, but also the splashing speech of waves on the rocks or on the pebbled beach, the moan of the wind, the monotonous roar of the airplane coursing overhead through the sky, monopolizing the whole soundscape. But that is meaningful. That is my organism, my animal flesh gleans all sorts of meanings from that monotonous drone, meanings that express something about the power of humankind to, monopolize everything else. The hum of the refrigerator in the next room, that too is a kind of voice, that, by which I mean that my body is affected, feels, takes, draws meaning from that. Sometimes it's a very calming sensation when I hear the refrigerator's, quiet motors just click on for a moment. The various ways that my home speaks, through the creaks in the walls as the weather is getting colder now. But everything speaks. Any sound can be a voice. Any movement can be a gesture laden with expressive resonance and meaning. Even the way the shadows shift across a cliff face can be felt as a kind of meaningful speech. So we speak as well. And our own utterances, including those we couch in words and verbal language, can participate richly in that much wider conversation and be informed by it, or our own speaking can sort of close itself off from all those other voices, so that we're just talking only to ourselves, as we do when we assume that language or meaningful speech is an entirely human possession, even an exclusively human power or property that distinguishes our species from all the other species. We've got meaningful speech, those other animals don't. But what arrogance and stupidity that is, because even our words, the various human languages we speak, English, French, Inuktitut, Swahili, all of our human verbal languages originated, have their old source in indigenous, animistic contexts where our bodies of phraseology and words are born not just through humans speaking to one another, but they're born in a kind of call and response to a speaking world. Because for our indigenous tribal ancestors, everything spoke. And so that still lives, or at least any of our languages still carry traces of that. The words we're going to use if we're speaking of the movement of a stream between the banks will be words like rush, gush, splash, rush. Well, the sound that unites all those words, splash, the rush of the river, the gush of water between the banks, the wash, the sound that unites all those words is the sound that the water itself speaks as it moves between the banks. That is to say, our human languages have been fed and informed by the speech of many things besides the human creature. And real human speaking, it seems to me, that carries rich meaning is informed by and still participant in that wider conversation. Maybe I should pause there, make sure. Does this make some simple, basic sense?
Absolutely. I think there is something in there for me about the notion of attempts to capture. It puts me in mind of the way that we attempt to capture birdsong in whatever language it is that we have. And that some people are wonderfully good. I've been in the woods with people who were able to mimic owl song, the deep, unearthly shapes of an owl's call. And mine are very poor. I'm no expert at all. But this idea that what is recorded by our bodies and ears and is transmitted into language is always an interpretative attempt. And if the owls or crows or frogs or the wind can or do hear us, they don't necessarily know that we are speaking to them. But I think sometimes when we make noise with our bodies, they do know that we are speaking to them, even if we are not imitating them. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about interspecies communication in that way.
Yeah, I think that almost imitative aspect where we try and shape our own tongue to meet the calls and cries of other creatures was at one time a very basic survival skill, because we couldn't bag another animal, an eland or a gazelle or a deer, or we'll be having venison tonight, actually. But we wouldn't be able to bag another animal for to feed ourselves and our family if we couldn't get close enough to those creatures. Of course, this was long before there was anything like guns and gunpowder. And so in order to hunt successfully, our ancestors had to apprentice themselves deeply to the ways of these other animals. And that included learning their calls and cries in order to draw those creatures, those birds, those others close enough that one might be able to take one. And I don't think by any means that this was just an aggressive relation, because you can't learn, you can't apprentice in this way. without opening the whole of your sensorium to the ways of this other being, and letting yourself be infected by the buffalo, by the bison. And that is why, at least on this continent, if one attends any of the dances, for instance, the dances at the pueblos around here, there will be turtle dances and bison dances, deer dance, in which the villagers take on the gestures and movements of these other creatures, whose dances, whose ways of moving are at the origin of all our human dance forms, just as their calls and cries are at the origin of all our human languages, because we had to imbibe those cries, had to practice them, and get good at speaking to those others. But I would say every, indigenous oral culture we know of spends just as much time talking to the land, talking to the mountain, calling the sun up out of the ground in the morning, just as much time speaking to the world as we tend to spend speaking about the world, talking about the weather, talking about this aspect or that aspect of nature. Our indigenous oral ancestors were not just speaking to a world that they felt also speaks, though often not in words, but they're also listening for the replies of things. And they also sense that when they're speaking, sometimes it's not just them, but the mountain that is speaking through them, or the place, or the woods that I'm walking through that are speaking and calling these words out through my mouth, through my tongue. So language, I would say, in an oral, and when we're speaking of deeply indigenous cultures that lived in some kind of basically reciprocal rapport with their surrounding landscapes in such a way that the land was never fully wrecked or damaged in its ability to replenish itself. When we're speaking of such cultures, by and large, we're speaking of oral cultures. That is, cultures that evolved, developed, thrived, often century after century after century, without any formal system of writing, without a system of writing that is tightly coupled to the spoken language. This is what we mean when we speak of oral cultures, which are cultures of story and storytelling, but also cultures of prayer, where language, yes, is used to speak to things. In a sense, prayer in its most basic, primordial meaning, it seems to me, simply means speaking to the world rather than speaking about the world, speaking to the ground, speaking to the wind. That's prayer or praying. So in an oral or non-writing context, even human language is far more participatory and interactive, and all sorts of elements that we might speak of as word magic are part and parcel of language, of human speech. But with the emergence of formal writing systems, this brings a strange new torsion or twist in our felt experience of the world. For one thing, when we're speaking and speaking orally and gesturing, other animals see and hear and can feel something of the bodily resonance of our calls and cries. But when we're just writing things down, the glyphs that we use don't make much or any sense to other creatures. But even more iconographic writing systems like the ideographic writing of China, or more anciently, the hieroglyphs of Egypt or of the Mayan culture, in these writing systems, you have shapes or stylized shapes of humans and human implements interspersed with shapes of other animals, of felines, of snakes and serpents, frogs, but also moonrise, sunset, cloud forms, rain falling from those clouds are all in the writing. They're there in the glyphs. And so the reader reading such a script is continually reminded of language's link to a much more than human land that still speaks in 1,000 tongues. It's as if the ideographic characters of Chinese writing, many of them still function as windows that open onto that wider speaking animate landscape. But with the emergence of an alphabet or of a phonetic writing system, the written characters no longer seem to image anything out there in the surrounding sensuous world. Rather, I see a G and it points me back toward my own mouth. I go, G. I see an M, I go, A D, I go, D. That is, the letters are no longer functioning as windows opening onto that wider land, but as mirrors reflecting the human form back upon itself. Only with the emergence of the alphabet do we begin to get this strange idea that language is an exclusively human property. And it's only as the alphabet comes into a previously oral culture, often carried by Christian missionaries teaching the good book. And, but it's only as the alphabet arrives in a priorly oral culture does that culture get this odd notion that language is an exclusively human property. And the rest of the land begins to fall mute. It no longer speaks. It's no longer, sprouting with stories that are telling themselves through every beak and cluster of rocks. So to me, this is a huge piece of the puzzle that that now grips our kind. That is the puzzle of how the living, breathing earth has undergone so many assaults due to our human obliviousness. We've been living for many centuries, at least since the printing press, in a regime of speech, of discourse, of language that steadily deadens the animate life in the world and that deafens our ears to all the other voices, to the expressive meaningfulness of the world around us. So it becomes much easier for us to treat the land just as a set of resources waiting to be used by us, if that land is not experienced as a source of meaningful speech and utterance and life.
Thank you so much. That's really beautiful. I was reminded of how you write, that you're trying to not just yourself write about the more than human, but also write in such a way that somehow educates our attention, or if read with the intent to do so, can become itself that magic. The way you describe magic is as a way, as a mode of communication, or maybe that's better, a way of doing language itself that can enable us to participate. And I think that's what's so striking about this concept of magic, because I think we were drawn to it, both Alice and I, because as I mentioned in the introduction, it's about possibility and it's about making change happen. And I think that's something we also lose sight of when we, as writers, work with language. It becomes, because it's, as you say, sort of quite abstract in the way we use it now. Because, I mean, I remember the day when I was about 10 or so, when I was shown the image that the letter A derived from, like the ox's head had been turned. It was an epiphany for me. Suddenly, as you say, like my own language came alive, and it all became magic from that day on. And that was just a way of seeing the letter A. It wasn't anything about the letter A. It was my way of seeing it that had changed. I love the way you describe this process as a shifting of perception and a tuning, a way of becoming more attentive, rather than a spell in the kind of cheap sense. Right?
Yikes, yes. Well, you know, one thing that's worth mentioning here, which links to what you're speaking of, is that my work, from the spell of the sensuous on, many essays I've written since then, and also Becoming Animal, my work has often been weirdly misunderstood by folks who don't read very carefully, as implying or saying straight out that writing is bad, or that the alphabet in particular is bad, that it is the cause of all our problems, and this kind of really unfortunate technology that just has closed down our senses, et cetera, that my work amounts to a kind of derogatory, disparaging of the written word and the alphabet, which is, for me, I mean, it's amazing that folks could conclude that, because I'm a writer, and I'm not just wielding my words on the page in a, in a kind of callous or cool way. They're fairly literary texts. They bespeak a real love for the language, including for the written language. The truth is, I'm not at all saying that writing is bad. I'm saying that writing is magic. And that phonetic writing, that the alphabet in particular, is a powerful, powerful magic. And that if we don't recognize it as such, then we tend to fall under its spell, which is the spell of spelling. And it's not by chance that those words have, that word has this different meaning, to arrange the letters in the right order to spell a name, or to cast a spell. Because to learn to arrange the letters rightly was to work a kind of magic upon the world, and also upon our own senses. If we recognize writing as a magic, not just as a neutral technology for the recording of oral speech, no, as a potent and powerful, transformative magic, then we can wield it responsibly, powerfully, like all the greatest authors do, to bring change in the world, to transform the world, to transform our culture hugely in relation to the world. I see writing and alphabetic literacy as a magic, yes, as a very concentrated form of animism or magic. When you think about it, if I think of coming down to the kitchen in the morning and opening up the newspaper and focusing my eyes on these ostensibly inanimate bits of ink on the page, and suddenly I hear voices, and I see visions of, Angela Merkel meeting with our so-called president somewhere in Europe, and I hear their voices and witness their conversations. But all I'm doing is actually just moving my eyes across these inanimate marks on the page. This is magic. This is animism, folks. It is not that different from the Lakota woman who steps out of the village, walking through the woods, and suddenly has her attention snagged by a spider web that, you know, she bumps into and tries to focus and find that spider weaving the web. And when she manages to catch sight of that little arachnid, starts following it with the focus of her eyes, and suddenly hears the spider speaking to her. Or a Pueblo man, you know, walking outside the village, coming upon, you know, some huge boulder with all these lichens spreading on its surface, and focusing his eyes on a patch of lichen, and abruptly hearing himself addressed by the boulder. We just do it with our own scratches and scripts. Our indigenous oral ancestors were doing it with lichen patches, bent twigs, branches, leaves fluttering in the gusts, storm clouds, mountains, footprints left by other animals, artifacts, houses speaking to us. Anything could speak. But once we step into the regime of literacy, and particularly alphabetic literacy, it's such a concentrated form of animistic participation that as soon as I see the written letters, I cannot help but see what they say. As soon as I come upon a sign in the middle of the wilderness, you know, I think I'm in the wilds in the backcountry, and I come upon a sign that says, deposit garbage here, and points toward a wastebasket. Immediately, the whole of the forest around me shrinks to about 1/3 of its size, because the written letters have such a potent magic that it soaks up the mana of the terrain so readily. As soon as we look at letters, we see what they say. They speak to us. They say. And in that sense, it seems to me that writing, particularly phonetic writing, particularly alphabetic writing, is such a concentrated form of magic that it effectively eclipses all of the other modalities of participation in which we once engaged. Writing is magic, very powerful magic. And so in that sense, the gods, the spirits have never left. They haven't fled. The magic hasn't disappeared from the world. It's just hiding in our relation to certain taken for granted aspects of our world that we take so much for granted. We just don't notice how outrageous, how mysterious they are. So my interest as a writer, I mean, I'm first hugely interested in storytelling, not writing stories, but telling stories with the whole of my body, and getting people telling stories again, and telling stories to our children as well, but not just reading to them from books, from storybooks, but putting the books down and weaving a story with your whole body, gesturing toward the moon or the walls, or the mouse that's skittering across the floor of your kid's bedroom, and weaving it into the story, but also telling, sometimes improvising, or even learning key stories that live in the land, out of doors, in the land, telling stories there about how this mountain came to be there, or how this bend in the river was formed when, you know, some old ancestor was walking along and stumbled at this point and kicked up a bunch of dirt that shoved the river in this strange pattern. Letting our stories be held by the land once again, telling stories out in the land and gathering people for the telling. But as a writer, because I also love the written medium, looking to write in such a way that opens the human mind back onto the larger mind that we are in, the mind that's not ours, but is Earth's. And in order to do that, it takes what we would rightly call word magic. But there are so many different types and forms of word magic, and I'm sure both of you sisters have steeped yourselves in aspects of that craft. And I'm curious your take on these things, but for me, word magic involves first and foremost paying attention to the materiality of one's words, to the rhythm of one's speaking, to the music and the lilt of one's language. And even on the page, looking to write and compose phrases that feel good in the mouth when you say them aloud, that taste good, and never to use words or phrases that are so abstract, that have been uprooted from the soil for so long that they've lost all of their earthly taste and resonance. So to avoid abstraction in the sense of, at least to avoid jargon, these jargony phrases that are so flung about all over academia that don't touch the body at all. They don't jangle our nerves or allure our erotic sensations, but just speak to a kind of disembodied intellect. You sort of know what I'm speaking of, I hope.
Absolutely.
So I think that this is a key part of our practice today, and of the magic in our practice. A key element in it is finding ways of speaking as full-bodied animals to other full-bodied animals. And when we're writing with the whole of our creaturely flesh, writing phrases, sentences, paragraphs or pages that lure and beckon and tickle the toes or the nostrils of the readers and make them sneeze. That involve the body, the animal body, so that when we're talking to others or when someone is reading our work, they're lured, their mind is lured from their, the upper parts of their skull down through their muscles, their knees, their elbows, their toe tips, that they begin sensing the world afresh with all of their creaturely senses awake. I think the way we wield our words is so key to how we got so estranged from the animate earth around us, and it's utterly key to how we bring our kind, our curious and oblivious species back into some kind of righteous rapport. Does that make some sense? Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yes, we do. And you've held us spellbound, for almost 2 hours, isn't it? It's an amazing demonstration of what you're talking about. It's the ability to make us attentive and take responsibility for our words. I think it's a lovely place to end as well.
If we have to be end-screened people, then it is an excellent example of the way that deictic language can travel through space and point us back out to the world.
Great.
I love it. Thank you so much for joining us, David. We could probably talk ongoingly. Thank you so much for being so kind and giving us your time.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the pleasure of this conversation.
Well, thank you, David, for that extraordinary interview. Listeners who want to learn more about David's work, I highly recommend visiting the Alliance for Wild Ethics website, of which David is founder and creative director, and also to visit the Magic and Ecology website, where you'll find a blog post accompanying the release of this podcast episode. And now it only remains to thank you, our listeners, for tuning into the Insurrection Interviews podcast. The podcast is part of Magic and Ecology, a year-long series of talks and online events where we invite researchers thinking about magic in relation to ecology and practitioners working with magic to transform modes of earth living in order to enable collaborative thinking across disciplines and practices. Magic and Ecology is hosted by CRASSH, the Centre for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Cambridge, and co-convened by Hjördis Becker-Lindenthal, Sophie Lunn-Rockcliffe, and myself, Simone Kotver. For more information and details of how to sign up for our upcoming live online events in 2021, please visit our website at magicecology.crash.cam.ac.uk.